This is the chilling tale of the Bell Witch haunting, one of the most infamous and terrifying legends in American history. In 1804, John Bell, a hard-working farmer, decided his small plot of land in North Carolina was no longer enough to support his growing family. Determined to start fresh, John, his kind-hearted wife Lucy, and their 6 children packed everything they owned onto wagons and made the arduous 600-mile journey west. Their destination? A sprawling 1,000-acre property along the Red River in northern Tennessee. At the time, the area, known as Robertson County, was remote and sparsely populated. The Bell family knew they were venturing into a rugged wilderness, where they would have to help build a settlement from scratch. For John Bell, this challenge wasn't daunting, it was exhilarating. A man of grit and generosity, he had been raised on hard work and perseverance. John and Lucy had always been known for their open hearts, often providing food, shelter, or money to struggling neighbors. Once they arrived in Robertson County, John wasted no time. He began by clearing trees from his land and using the timber to build a sturdy 1.5-story log house on a hill near the Red River, a scenic spot popular among locals for picnicking and fishing. The Bell family quickly became beloved in the small community. Their home's proximity to the river meant frequent visits from neighbors, and their warm hospitality earned them many friends. Over the years, the Bells thrived. The children attended school in the mornings, walking through the woods and returning home by sunset. John and his sons worked the land, built structures for the settlement, and constructed boats to transport their farm's goods, tobacco and meats, for trade. The family grew, with John and Lucy welcoming 3 more children in their new home. Their oldest children even started their own families nearby. Life seemed perfect, but then came the summer of 1817. That summer, 13 years after they settled in Robertson County, John Bell experienced something strange. Something he brushed off at the time, but would later recognize as the beginning of their ordeal. It was a sweltering afternoon, and John was walking alone through his cornfield when he noticed something unusual. Sitting right in the middle of the field was a large dog. At first, John thought little of it. Dogs were common in the area. But as he got closer, his stomach tightened. This wasn't a normal dog. Its body was grotesque, almost deformed, as if its bones had been broken and healed at odd angles. It was enormous, far too big for any dog John had ever seen. Its mangy fur bristled in the sunlight, and its eyes felt human. They locked onto John's, unblinking, unyielding, as though the creature was studying him. John, a man not easily rattled, felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. He gripped his rifle and raised it, aiming at the creature. Without hesitation, he fired. The dog-like beast bolted, galloping awkwardly toward the tree line. John watched it vanish into the dense woods. Still shaken, he walked to the spot where it had been sitting, expecting to see trampled corn or paw prints in the dirt. But there was nothing. No sign the creature had been there at all. John stood there, his mind racing. How could this be? There had to be tracks, something, but the earth was undisturbed. Forcing himself to dismiss it, he shook his head. Just a strange dog, he thought. Nothing more. He turned and walked back to his house, the unsettling encounter slipping to the back of his mind. But the strangeness didn't end there. Not long after John's encounter in the cornfield, strange events began plaguing the Bell household. It started with knocking. Late at night, when the family was in bed, a sharp rap would echo through the house, coming from the walls. John and his sons would leap out of bed, rushing outside to catch the culprit, but they never found anyone. There were no footprints around the house, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. The knocking grew bolder, moving from wall to wall, as if taunting them. John, convinced it was the work of pranksters, ordered his family to keep quiet about the disturbances. He didn't want to give the troublemakers the satisfaction of knowing they were rattled. But weeks passed, and the tapping persisted. Every night it returned, and every night it stopped the moment anyone went to investigate. And then, the real terror began. The Bells' nightmare was only just beginning. 4 of John Bell's sons were sound asleep in their shared bedroom when a strange sound woke them up. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. The sharp, repetitive noise of something gnawing on wood. It sounded like a rat was desperately chewing on one of their bedposts. The two oldest brothers, sleeping on the bottom bunks, swung their legs over the side of their beds and stepped onto the wooden floor to investigate. But as soon as their feet touched the ground, the gnawing sound stopped. The boys glanced at each other, unease creeping in. They scoured the room, checking the corners and beneath the beds. They ran their fingers along the posts, expecting to find fresh bite marks, but there was nothing. Not a single sign of any animal. Frustrated and confused, the boys climbed back into bed, deciding to dismiss it. But the moment they closed their eyes, the noise returned. This time louder, faster, almost frantic. It sounded as though whatever was under there was trying to chew its way through the wood in a frenzy. The boys shot out of bed again, hearts pounding. Once more, the room fell completely silent. The gnawing stopped. They crouched low, looking under the beds and checking every nook and cranny, but the room was empty. No rat, no animal, nothing. The brothers didn't sleep much that night, haunted by the relentless sound that would return every time they tried to rest. The same thing happened the next night, and the night after that, it got even worse. On the third night, as the exhausted boys lay in bed, trying to ignore the eerie gnawing, a new sound joined it, a horrifying sound. It was low and wet, someone gasping for air, choking, gulping, smacking their lips as though they were struggling to breathe. The sound came from directly beneath their beds. The boys froze in terror. For several minutes, they lay motionless, too afraid to move. But eventually, the oldest brothers summoned their courage and leapt from their beds to confront whatever was hiding below. Their feet hit the floor. The gasping stopped. The room was silent again, as if nothing had ever happened. But the boys couldn't shake the fear clinging to them like a second skin. They woke the rest of their family, and together they searched the entire house, top to bottom. Every corner, every shadow, every crack was inspected. Yet as before, they found nothing. No rats, no claw marks, no evidence of any kind. To this point, John Bell had insisted that the family not tell anyone in town about the strange happenings. He believed someone was playing an elaborate prank, and he wanted to catch them in the act. But now, with the boys too terrified to sleep and the eerie sounds escalating, John confided in a trusted neighbor. The neighbor listened carefully. John was not a man given to exaggeration or nonsense, and his honest reputation made the neighbor take the story seriously. So seriously, in fact, that the neighbor offered to spend the night at the Bell house to witness the events for himself. That night, the neighbor stayed over, and he didn't have to wait long. The knocking on the walls started first. Then came the sound of gnawing in the boys' room, followed by the dreadful gasping and choking noises. The neighbor, a rational man, was terrified. He couldn't explain what he was hearing. He didn't last the night, fleeing the Bell house in the middle of the night to return to his own. Word spread quickly throughout Robertson County. The Bells, beloved for their kindness and central to the town's founding, found themselves surrounded by a wave of support. Townspeople took shifts staying at the Bell home, hoping their presence would deter whatever was tormenting the family. It didn't work. No matter how many people crowded into the house, the noises persisted. Knocks on the walls, scratching, gnawing, and always that terrible, wet, gasping sound. Desperate to find an explanation, the townspeople concocted theories. Some speculated that John's youngest daughter might be playing tricks for attention. Others suggested someone with a grudge against the Bells was behind the disturbances. One even floated the idea that a skilled ventriloquist was throwing their voice to torment the family. But none of these theories held up. The house was searched over and over, and no culprit was ever found. Observers even stayed up to watch each member of the Bell family as they slept, ensuring none of them could be responsible. Yet while they watched, the noises would start again, clear as day, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Meanwhile, John Bell began to change. The once lively and attentive man grew distant. He'd be in the middle of a conversation when his face would suddenly slacken, his jaw trembling slightly, his eyes unfocused. At first, these episodes were brief and subtle, but over time, they became more severe. John's jaw would quiver uncontrollably. His eyes would blink out of sync, and his hands would twitch erratically. When the episode passed, he wouldn't say a word to the person he'd been speaking to. He would simply turn and wander back to his bedroom, sitting on the edge of his bed for hours, staring at the wall. The family was at a loss. They felt trapped in their own home, unable to escape the constant dread. The townspeople, desperate to find a culprit, turned their suspicions toward Kate Batts, an eccentric neighbor. Kate was considered odd, with her strange way of speaking and the tragedies that surrounded her. Her husband was disabled, and all three of her children had died young. Some whispered that Kate had cursed the Bell family. Kate, however, was furious when she heard the rumors. She denied any involvement, insisting she had nothing to do with the Bell family's torment. By 1820, 3 years after the disturbances began, the Bells had somehow adjusted to their haunted reality. But John was deteriorating rapidly. His episodes grew more frequent, and his silent hours in his room stretched longer. Privately, he confessed to Lucy that he felt as though someone was killing him. Then one day his daughter Esther went out to gather eggs from the hen house. As she crossed the lane, she heard faint footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw a woman in black, walking slowly down the road toward the Bell house. Her head was bowed, her bonnet obscuring her face. Esther had just come from that direction and hadn't seen anyone on the road before now. Curious but unalarmed, Esther assumed it was a neighbor. She turned back toward the hen house, gathered her eggs, and stepped outside again. The woman in black was still there, closer now. Esther began walking toward her, calling out a cheerful hello. The woman didn't respond. She didn't turn. She didn't even lift her head. Unease prickled at Esther's skin. She quickened her pace, closing the gap between them. Again she called out, her voice louder now. Still, the woman trudged forward, ignoring her. 15 feet away, Esther stopped, her heart racing. She stared at the stranger's back, her mouth dry. Suddenly, the woman stopped too. Without turning, she reached up slowly and removed her bonnet. When the bonnet fell to the ground, a cascade of tangled, matted black hair spilled down her back. Esther froze. The woman raised her hands to her head and began to stroke her hair. At first, it looked like she was trying to smooth it out, her fingers weaving through the dark strands. But soon her movements became frantic. She was no longer combing her hair. She was ripping it out. Esther's stomach turned as clumps of hair fell to the ground. The sound of it tearing from the scalp filled the air, a grotesque and unmistakable noise that sent chills down her spine. "Stop it!" Esther screamed. But the woman didn't respond. Her hands moved faster, yanking and pulling with such intensity that Esther felt rooted to the spot, unable to look away. Panic surged within her. She turned on her heel and bolted for the house, her basket of eggs forgotten. She slammed the door behind her and locked it, her breaths coming in gasps. "Get in here, come quick!" she yelled to her sister, her voice trembling. Together, the two of them ran to the front window and peered outside. The woman was still there, clawing at her scalp, hair littering the ground around her. And then, as though sensing their gaze, the woman stopped. Slowly, she turned her head and locked eyes with Esther through the window. The two sisters recoiled in terror. The woman's face was gaunt, her eyes hollow and piercing. She dropped her hands from her head and stood motionless, staring up at them. Then, without warning, she turned and walked around the side of the property, disappearing from their line of sight. "She's going to the side yard," Esther whispered, her voice cracking. The two sisters scrambled to another window, desperate to keep track of her. What they saw made their blood run cold. The woman was climbing over their fence, and behind her were 3 small children. Where had they come from? The children followed her silently, their faces pale and blank, like little ghosts. Esther and her sister watched in horror as the woman and the children walked into a grove of trees on the Bell property. One by one, they began climbing separate trees. When they reached the top, they turned to face the house. The woman and children began to sway, rocking their bodies in unison. The trees bent unnaturally under their movements, as though the earth itself were responding to their presence. Esther's breath hitched as she gripped her sister's arm. "What are they doing?" her sister whispered, her voice barely audible. At that moment, Esther's husband burst into the house. "What's going on? Why are you screaming?" he asked, rushing to their side. "Look!" Esther cried, dragging him to the window. "They're in the trees. Do you see them?" Her husband frowned as he peered outside. "I see trees swaying. What am I supposed to see?" "They're right there," Esther shouted, pointing frantically. But no matter how hard she tried to explain, Her husband couldn't see the woman or the children. Only the unnatural swaying of the trees remained, as if haunted by invisible forces. The family rushed outside to confront the intruders, but when they reached the grove, there was nothing. No woman, no children, not even footprints in the dirt. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. A few weeks later, John Bell was out walking with his son when something horrifying happened. One moment, John was fine, striding across their land. The next, he froze in place, his hands shooting up to his face as if to shield himself from an invisible attacker. His body contorted unnaturally, his back arching so violently that his son feared it would snap. "Father!" the boy cried, rushing to his side. Before he could reach him, a blood-curdling shriek pierced the air. It was so loud and otherworldly that the boy stopped in his tracks, covering his ears. It didn't seem to come from anywhere, or anything, nearby. And then, just as quickly as it began, the sound stopped. John collapsed to the ground, trembling. "I don't have much time left," he whispered through tears, his voice barely audible. His son helped him to his feet, and they returned home in silence. John went straight to bed and didn't leave his room again. By December 19th, 1820, John was worse than ever. That morning, he didn't come down for breakfast. When his family went to check on him, they found him lying in bed, breathing but unresponsive. They couldn't wake him. In a panic, one of his sons opened the medicine cabinet to fetch something that might help, but all the usual remedies were gone. In their place was a strange glass vial filled with a dark, smoky liquid. "What is this?" the son asked, holding up the vial. No one in the family recognized it. They called a doctor, who, baffled by John's condition, suggested testing the liquid on an animal. A stray cat was given a small amount, and within minutes it was dead. Despite their efforts, John Bell passed away the next morning. His death marked the end of most of the torment. Those strange lights and eerie voices were reported on the Bell property for years afterward. Today, the Bell house is gone, but legends say the terror originated from a nearby cave, a dark, silent place where some believe the spirit still lingers.